In my last video, I went over how to set up an Android emulator using Android Studio and how to access that emulator using ADB. And I also went over how to root that emulator with Magisk. And if all you want to do is just set up an emulator so you can run some Android apps and things on your PC without having to have an actual physical Android device, that will be more than enough to do what you need. But if you're like me and you're interested in using your emulator to do things like pen testing or bug bounty hunting or any sort of mobile hacking, you're also going to need to make sure that that emulator is set up to work with all your hacker tools. So in this video, I'm going to go over how to set it up to work with Burp Suite so you can intercept network traffic, and Frida so you can run Frida scripts and use objection and do all those cool things you need to do at runtime to bypass SSL pinning and all kinds of other things that Frida lets you do. So let's get started. Just a reminder, I am using an emulator that is a Pixel 8 running Android 12, and it is rooted so that it uses Magisk, which is going to be important in this next part. If you need to know how to set that up, check out my last video. And for this current setup, because I do have my emulator running on a Windows machine, I'm also going to be running Burp Suite on my Windows machine. If you're using either Mac or Linux, all this stuff should be pretty much the same, just with some different file paths and things like that. But I typically recommend whatever host machine is running your emulator, that's also the same machine you should be running Burp Suite from. I typically prefer Linux in a lot of situations, and I'll probably end up using Linux when we get to Frida. And it is probably possible to set up a system where you have an emulator running on your host machine and you have Burp Suite inside a virtual machine and they're able to still intercept traffic. But that would probably require some like port forwarding and stuff that I don't really want to get into at this point. So if possible, I really suggest just whatever your host machine that has your emulator running on it, that's the same machine where you should have your Burp Suite running. And I've talked about it on this channel in several videos in the past, but in order to actually intercept traffic with your Burp Suite proxy, you need to install that certificate on the device. But modern versions of Android don't actually work with user certificates anymore, so you have to have that certificate installed as a root system level certificate, and it can be a bit complex to get that certificate set up as a system level cert. But fortunately, we have this Magisk Trust User Certs module that does all the hard work for us. So we're just going to go to this GitHub page that I'll have linked in the description down below, and I'm going to go to releases, and I'm going to download always trust user certs.zip. Once we have that downloaded, I'm going to use ADB to actually push that file onto my device. I showed you how to use ADB in the last video, but just a reminder, you go to your platform tools, which by default is in this location right here, and I'm going to run ADB push, and then the path to wherever you downloaded that file, which for me is going to be in my downloads folder, and then the path to wherever you want to push that file onto your file system of your emulator device. I'm just going to put it on the SD card, and once that's on the device, I'm going to go to my Magisk app on my emulator, and I'm going to click this modules button in the bottom right corner, and I'm going to click install from storage. And I'm just going to go to my phone storage, and I'm going to see this little file right here that I just pushed. Install confirmation, okay. And then it's just going to take a couple seconds to install, and then I'm going to have to reboot the device. Once the device reboots, now if we go back to our modules in our Magisk app, we see that we have that module installed. And now all we need is our Burp Suite certificate. So in order to get our certificate, first we need to open up Burp Suite, and I'm going to go to Proxy tab and the Proxy settings. And typically whenever I'm working with a physical device, I would need to change this IP address on the interface to an IP address that my physical device could see. So that would be the IP address of the actual machine and not the 127.0.0.1. But because my emulator is running on the same machine as my Burp Suite instance, then I can just leave it as that 127.0.0.1. And now in my emulator, I'm just going to click on these little three dots in the bottom of this little strip at the right side, and that's just going to open this little menu, and I'm going to go down to click on settings, and then the proxy tab, and I'm going to select the manual proxy configuration, and I'm going to set the host name as 127.0.0.1 and the port number 8080. And now to get the actual certificate from Burp Suite, a lot of the documentation actually tell you to open a web browser on the device and go to http://burp. But I actually saw a comment from someone in my last video where they were having issues getting to that site in their web browser, and I actually tried that myself and I also couldn't get it. I'm honestly not sure why. But fortunately, there's another way to actually get your certificate. If we go back to our proxy settings, there's this button right below our proxy listeners where we can import or export a CA certificate. So if we click that and we click export certificate in DER format, click next, and I'm going to save that file as burp.crt. Now that we have that certificate exported, I'm going to go back to my command prompt and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with that Magisk module file, and I'm going to run adb push, and then the path to where that certificate file was downloaded. And once again, I'm just going to push it onto the SD card of my device. Now that we have that certificate onto our file system of our device, now I'm going to go to the settings and I'm going to go to security, encryption and credentials, install certificate, CA certificate, install anyway. And here I see that burp.crt file and CA certificate installed. But once again, that only gets us part of the way there. We see that that certificate is installed as a user cert. But again, modern versions of Android do not work with user certificates. We have to get it as a system cert. And when we look at the list of system certs, we see that it is in alphabetical order and that port swigger certificate should be right there in between the N's and the Q's, but right now it's not there. Fortunately, that's where this Always Trust User Certificates module comes in. If we just close our emulator and then relaunch it, now when we go back to look at our trusted credentials, we see, once again, we still have our port swigger certificate as a user cert, but this time when we go to system certs, we see right there in between the N's and the Q's, it is right there as a system level cert. Because that Magisk module that we installed, it actually took any certs that were in our user certs, and when the device was rebooted, it automatically moved it over to the system level certs. And now after rebooting the device, with my proxy set in my settings of my emulator, if I go to a website in my web browser on my device, now I see that traffic is being captured with my Burp Suite proxy. And that works for intercepting traffic from apps on the device as well, not just from the web browser. But as I've mentioned many times on this channel in different videos, sometimes you might run into issues where you can't intercept traffic, and a lot of times that's because they have SSL pinning enabled. And one of the best tools for bypassing SSL pinning, as well as doing all kinds of other things involving some runtime manipulation of the application, is a tool called Frida. And to install Frida, I'm actually going to be working from a Linux virtual machine, just because typically when I'm working with Frida, I'm going to be working with the command line a lot more, and I personally just much prefer the Linux command line over the Windows command prompt. But you can use Frida from any machine where you have an ADB connection. And as I mentioned in my last video, in order to connect to your emulator with ADB from your VM, you need to use the special 10.0.2.2 alias address. So I'm just going to run ADB connect 10.0.2.2. And when I run that, I'm going to get this allow USB debugging pop up on my emulator. I'm going to click allow. And then when I run ADB devices, I see that my device is now connected. And now I need to download the Frida server that I'm going to actually install on my device. And to do this, I'm just going to go to the Frida GitHub page and I'm going to click on releases. And I'm going to go to the latest release and I'm going to click show all assets. And now we need to scroll down until we find our proper server that we need to download. It is important here that you know the architecture of your emulator. And if we check our Android Studio Device Manager, we see that this emulator is an x86-64 emulator. So we're going to scroll down until we find Frida server, the version number, Android x86-64, and that's the server that we're going to download. First, we need to uncompress that file, and we're going to do that by running unxz and then that file name. And now I'm going to just rename this file to just Frida server, just so we're not working with such a long file name. This isn't necessary at all. Whatever the name of the file is doesn't have any bearing on how any of this works. But just for my own convenience, I'm going to rename this file. But now that we have our server file downloaded and we also have our ADB connection active, now I'm going to push that file and I'm going to put it in the /data/local/temp directory on our Android file system. And now if we drop into an ADB shell, we see that we do have this $ prompt, which means we are not root, but in the last video we rooted this device, so I'm just going to run su, and now we see that prompt changes to a $, and that means we're root now. And now I'm just going to cd into that data local temp directory, and when we run ls, we see that Frida server file that we just pushed onto the device, but we also need to change the permissions on that file so we can run it properly. So I'm going to run a chmod 755 and then the name of that file. So now that file is executable, so we can execute it by running a period / and then the name of the file. A lot of the documentation you see about this will tell you to run it with an ampersand, which actually is supposed to background the process, so you don't have to keep that tab open in order to keep it running. But I personally just prefer keeping it running without the ampersand in a tab, and then I'll just open a new tab or a new terminal to do whatever else I want to do. This is purely personal preference at this point, but I just like having this open just in case there are any errors or anything that happens with Frida. I can see any output that might happen from the Frida server. So now that we have our Frida server installed on our emulator, now we need to actually install the Frida tools that we're going to use to run the Frida commands from our machine. To do this, I'm just going to run pip3 install Frida tools. After you do that, you should be able to run commands with Frida, like Frida -- help, just to get the help file. And just a reminder, if you're ever having problems with Frida, one of the most common problems people have is because they have a version mismatch. So if you want to check your version of Frida that you have installed, you can just run Frida -- version, and you can see I have version 16.4.3 installed. And if you remember, that was the latest version of Frida where I downloaded that server that I installed on my emulator. But if at any point you forget what version you have installed, or you just want to double check, you can always go back to the ADB shell where you have that Frida server installed on your device, and you can just run Frida server -- version, and that will tell you the version that you have installed in that one as well. But now that we have our Frida server running on our device, and we also have Frida installed on our machine, now we can run Frida scripts. For example, we can run Frida -ps UIA, and that will return all the apps that are installed on the device and their package names and everything, and that can get you started on running any sort of Frida scripts or anything you want to run. I won't go into details of like how to run specific Frida scripts or use objection or anything like that, because I've covered that in other videos, and there's all kinds of resources out there on how to run specific scripts to bypass SSL pinning or do anything like that that you might want to do. But now you not only know how to get a Burp Suite certificate installed so you can intercept network traffic, but you also know how to get a Frida server installed and start running Frida scripts on your device. So between what I covered in the last video and this video, I feel like you have a pretty good foundation of everything you need to get started with Android pen testing using an emulator. There will certainly be situations where a physical device is much more convenient and maybe the only option for some things you want to test. And if you end up spending a lot of time doing this kind of thing, I highly recommend getting some sort of cheap Android device off of eBay or somewhere. But if you're just getting started, or this is just like a hobby side project for you, then this is plenty to get you started on using an emulator, and you can do all this for free without any extra investment in hardware. But that's going to be it for this video though. I hope you learned something. I hope you got some sort of value out of it. And if you did, I hope I see you in the next one.